Daddy's Little Anna. Chapter 17. The Streets of King's Cross. Swinging his rucksack onto his back and tucking the dick the shit into the front of his leather jacket as usual, Brian led me to a roundabout leading to the London road, and we settled down on the verge to wait for a lift. Almost. The first vehicle to appear was a police motorbike, and for a moment I thought the game was up before we'd even managed to get out of the town. But as we watched in amazement, the bike tilted, went into an uncontrollable skid and toppled over, dragging the poor rider along the tarmac with it. All Brian's biker instincts came to the fore immediately at the sight of a fellow traveller in trouble. Thrusting Dick into my arms, he told me to go into the nearby park while he helped the policeman. It was a typical Brian gesture, the sort of thing that made him popular with everyone he met. Once the policeman had been safely removed in an ambulance and the fuss had died down, we took our positions again and headed south in the first truck that stopped for us. We were in no particular hurry to get to London, and Brian was always open to new experiences when we was on his travels. He had a little one-man tent in his rucksack, so we could stop off whenever we wanted to and pitch our own private camp, squeezing in the tent together to sleep. As we still had a bit of money in our pockets from his last gyro and my earnings from the street, we spent a couple of days in Banham, a village that boasts a famous cider house, and got absolutely sloshed, living in our tent in the woods like a couple of runaway kids. It all seemed to be a great adventure, and I always felt so safe with Brian, confident that he would protect me from any danger. When we finally arrived in London, we took the tube to King's Cross, which Brian knew was a place where we might be able to find cheap accommodation. I'm sure he genuinely was trying to save me from Dad and from incarceration in Salter's Lodge, but it probably wasn't the best idea for us to head straight to one of the most infamous red light districts in the country. It didn't really matter how cheap the accommodation was, because by then we'd spent all the money we'd had set out with. With nowhere to stay and no money in our pockets, we just wandered around the streets, talking to people who looked as though they might inhabit the same sort of world as us, until eventually someone told us about a squat they heard of in a derelict house which might be worth investigating. Our luck was in, and when we got there we were told there was one small room still going spare on the ground floor. Even by our standards, the house was in a pretty disgusting state, but at least it was a roof over our heads, and it took us off the streets. A tent is of limited use when you're in the middle of a city. We didn't fancy sleeping rough, and we could hardly turn up at a homeless shelter, given that I was underage and on the run. There was a sink in the room with a cold tap that dribbled at the time. There was nowhere else in the house for us to wash or shower, and I only had one set of clothes that I'd run away from Salter's lodging. Each night I had to wash my one pair of knickers, scrubbing at them with a bar of soap as I'd seen Nanny do so many times at her kitchen sink. It was a bit like being a child again, surviving between Nanny's weekly washing sessions. Only worse because there was no clean clothes waiting for us at the end of each week. My spirits were pretty low, but I still hoped Brian would be able to find work and look after me as we had agreed. To give him his due, he did his best to look for work so we could buy some food, but he just couldn't find anything. I guess by then, neither of us looked or smelled particularly appealing. It soon became obvious that the only option left open to us was for me to go on the game to get a bit of money together so that at least we wouldn't starve. It was a scary prospect, but hunger was scarier. The grubby, manic streets of King's Cross was 1,000 times more terrifying than the block in Norwich, and I no longer had Dad's protection to protect me when I was out there, parading around for business. I was just one more runaway teenager amongst hundreds, a truly disposable item in the desperate marketplace for youthful flesh. If one of my punters had decided to kill me and dispose of my body, who would have known or cared? Only Brian and Dick the shit, and who would have taken any notice of anything Brian had to say, when he was a guy who had brought me there in the first place? Most of the time, I got myself high on speed or acid before I went out to work, just so that I could overcome my fears. But the drugs cost even more money and meant I had to service more punters. It was like I was sleepwalking through a bad dream, doing everything by rote just as Dad had taught me to, not wanting to allow myself to think too much about what I was doing and where it was likely to lead me. The other prostitutes working in King's Cross all looked older and harder and more vicious than any of the girls I'd ever met in Norwich. There was no one here like Lucy. These were people who everyone had given up on. Junkies, schizophrenics, and God alone knew what else. I'd never really known many black people before, apart from Gail, and I didn't understand the way they or their pimps acted or talked to me. I couldn't tell the difference between the normal speech patterns and threatening behaviour. It was like occupying an alien landscape where I was unable to read or understand any of the signs around me. Everything seemed strange and dangerous, angry and aggressive. The routine of walking up to curb-crawling cars was exactly the same as it had been in Burr Street, but there was no local country lane to take the punters to now, just scruffy back streets and seedy hotel rooms that could be rented by the hour. The streets where I worked looked a bit like Albert Square from EastEnders, with seats in the centre surrounded by black railings and a path all round the outside, full of furtive shadows, litter and parked cars. I was so intimidated by the manic activity and the aggression all around me that I would only do one trick at a time, earning just enough so we could buy some food and some drugs, scurrying back to Brian and Dick as soon as it was over, and then not going back out there again until the money had run out and we were hungry once more. It wasn't like working for Dad, where I would have to stay out until the last client had gone home. I was my own boss now, and I could do as many or as few as I wanted. Except I wasn't really the boss. Hunger was the one in charge. One of the pimps on the street, a black guy, dripping in charm and gold jewellery, was being quite flirty and nice with me one afternoon when I was looking for business. There wasn't much going on. The punters always more discreet in the daylight, and because I was new to the area, and I wasn't able to recognise the regulars unless they made themselves obvious, which put me at a disadvantage. "Do you need any help?" he asked cheerily. "Well," I admitted reluctantly, "yeah. I've got a nice little job if you want it." He had such a disarming way about him, I agreed to go with him, without thinking, my powers of judgment no doubt befuddled by a mixture of drugs and hunger. As he led me down onto a tube train, the fears were already starting to take root inside. What was I doing? I was in a strange city, and I knew nothing about this guy. Why had I agreed to go with him? But by then I was too scared to say anything or make a run for it, so I just sat silently beside him in the loud, rattling carriage, waiting stupidly to see what would happen next. I was no more than a defenceless, lost child. I had no idea where we were going, or how I would get back, and I had no money at all. I had put myself completely at the mercy of a man who made his living from pimping. His mood had changed now we were down in the tunnels of the underground, and he was talking to me in an aggressive tone, all his smiley street charms evaporating, as if I had irritated it out of him, as if I was a burden to him with my childish nervousness. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Shut the fuck up," he snapped. "You'll fucking see when we get there." I felt a prick in my arm on the side where he was sitting, but by the time I looked down, there was nothing there. Looking back, I'm pretty sure he injected me with something. But at the time, I couldn't work out what had happened, and my mind was beginning to cloud over even more. I suddenly felt really stoned and couldn't concentrate at all what was going on around me, like I was dreaming the whole scene. A little part of my brain told me that I was going to die, but I couldn't do anything about it. I could do nothing but submit to this man's guiding hands as he bundled me roughly out of the carriage at our destination. All I wanted to do was lie down and sleep, but he kept propelling me forward, catching me and propping me back up impatiently whenever I stumbled. There was no way now that my legs would have been able to run, even if I had the courage to try. It was taking every ounce of my concentration just to walk, and I wouldn't have known where to run to anyway. As we emerged into the light, I couldn't see any white faces in my direction. This was a world he was comfortable in, and I felt very alone and very vulnerable. He led me along roads filled with identical looking little houses. I could hear reggae music playing, and the atmosphere was relaxed and friendly and hippie-ish. I was aware of the aromas of unfamiliar foods. When we went into one of the houses, there seemed to be people everywhere, and I think there was a party going on. My escort gripped my arm hard, pushed me down firmly onto a settee, and left me as the party went on around me, in a dizzying sway of strange faces and voices, none of which I could quite get into focus. Despite all the fears clamouring to make themselves heard in my fuzzy head, I was unable to stop myself from giving in to the overwhelming need to sleep. When I woke up, it was 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. The room swam into focus around me as I strained to remember where I was and how I got there. All about me were sleeping bodies, but I couldn't see the pimp from King's Cross anywhere. I felt a rush of relief to find that I was still alive, and apparently unharmed. Being careful not to disturb anyone, I gingerly got to my feet and tiptoed out of the house, quietly pulling the front door behind me and walking away in the dawn light, not having any idea where I was going, but wanting to put as much distance between me and that house as possible. However hard I tried to concentrate, I couldn't work out what might have happened during the hours that I was sleeping in that house. But I was deeply grateful to be alive. Had I been raped? Perhaps by more than one man? Or did they just leave me alone since I was so soundly asleep? God knows how I managed it with no money. I must have begged a tube fare off someone or jumped the barriers, but I got back to the squat where Brian was almost at the point of contacting the police to report me missing. He was beside himself with worry, and I was deeply shaken to think how much danger I had put myself in. I could so easily have disappeared that night, never to be seen again, and I doubt if the police would have put in too much time looking for me. The whole London experience was making me a nervous wreck. I felt almost as insecure and threatened inside the squat as I did out on the streets. A Scottish couple lived on the floor above us, both of them heavy drinkers who would row in voices filled with bitterness and aggression whenever they were drunk. It sounded as though they had a long history of grievances, which the drink released over and over again. During one of their endless fights, the man lost his grip on reality and stabbed his partner in the stomach on the stairs just outside our room. There was blood everywhere, and I was terrified that sooner or later Brian and I were going to end up murdered in our beds. We decided it was time to admit we'd made our mistake and to leave London before anything worse happened. We got back onto the road, out of the city, and headed up to Northampton to stay with another friend of Brian's called Kevin.